I'm Gordon Anderson. I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the third in our series of Basilar lectures. I've introduced our speaker tonight twice already, and some of you are probably tired of hearing it, and probably he is too, so I'm going to make this short. But this is the third in a series of 4 lectures associated with the Wayne G. Basilar Chair of Excellence for the Integration of the Arts, Rhetoric and Science here at ETSU. Our Basilar lecturer this year is Dr. Graham Leonard, and just before I turn over to him, let me remind you that he will have one more talk, which is on Tuesday, March the 24th, and is entitled Modernizing Education versus Westernizing Schooling in the Middle East. Dr. Leonard is a native of Kingsport, Tennessee, but he has lived, worked, and traveled in the Middle East for over 50 years. And so he is very well equipped to deliver this evening's lecture. In fact, he's going back to the Middle East again early next month for a short visit this time. This evening, he's going to cover a very broad topic, one that I think should be of interest to all of us. His talk is entitled Differences in the Ways of Thinking in the Middle East and the West. Dr. Leonard.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. You've been listening to the second surah of the Quran, which is the Surah Al-Baqarah, or the chapter about the cow. It is one of the most sonorous of all the chapters, and there's a wonderful story with it. When Prince Faisal was given the keys to the city of Edinburgh in Scotland with Lawrence of Arabia, he was asked to give a speech. And instead, he said to Lawrence in Arabic, you give the speech, I will recite the Surah Al-Baqarah. And so he recited what you've been hearing, which is very sonorous and beautiful, and everyone was very impressed. And then Lawrence got up and gave the address that he thought that Prince Faisal should give in English. I'm going to talk tonight about a subject that is very, very subjective. So you need to know a little bit about the person that's making all of these so-called statements. We cannot communicate with each other unless we use a lot of generalities. So I'm going to be using all kinds of generalities tonight, none of which I could prove in a court of law. So please forgive me if I'm a little too general in the statements I make about what Westerners think and do and what Arabs think. Please, I'm not trying to say anything is better than anything else. And I might add, in addition to my academic credentials, I'm a trained psychotherapist. I trained with the famous R.D. Laing in London. And so I've been looking into people's minds as much as one can all of my life. I'm very curious. My relatives and friends say nosy. But so that you're getting the experience of that. We have compiled, my assistant Stephen and I, this long list of comparisons between how Westerners think and Americans think. I'm mostly talking about Arabs and mostly Arab Muslims in the Middle East, but I'm also talking about Americans more than about Europeans. But you will get a copy of this. Don't forget to get one of these handouts before you leave. There are enough for everyone in the room, I think, to take with you. And that is the handout. But I'm going to speak specifically on 3 subjects. The Middle Easterners, like most of the world, do not think as individuals first, but think as a group. They think first about family, and through family, clan, and through clan, religious or ethnic community. Milli is the word in Turkish. Westerners, for over 3 centuries, ever since the so-called Age of Reason, have been trying to be more and more individualistic. Not entirely successfully, I might add. But that's a huge comparison that is very rarely talked about. Most of the world thinks as a group. They think of themselves not as I, but as we. And I didn't understand this until I was in China teaching. And I learned that Mao knew that he could not break that strong sense of family identity. So he created something called socialist study groups. Everyone in China belonged to a socialist study group where they lived or where they worked. And their loyalty was transferred from family to that socialist study group. They would not squeal on anyone in their group, but they would squeal on people in their family. So he knew he could not break the family identity. He could only shift it to somewhere else. That's how strong group identity is in most of the world. Middle Easterners have for 5 centuries lived under the Ottoman Empire, about 1453 until 1918, 1920. And each individual milli, that is a religious or ethnic community, had its own laws, its own judges, its own courts for marriage, divorce, and inheritance. And if there was murder within your own community, even murder was tried by your own courts. Now, this makes a very strong cohesion for your identity in your religious or ethnic community. When we went into Iraq, people kept saying to me, what is the difference theologically between the Shias and the Sunnis? What do they believe that's different from each other? That is not the question. The question is they've had 500 years of killing each other, persecuting each other, hating each other, ruling each other one time after the other. So they have 500 years of anger built up. And now we in East Tennessee understand that. We have feuds because somebody insulted Great Aunt Susie 100 years ago. We still are feuding over it. So they have the same thing, but it's not 100 years, it's 500 years. So you need to understand that much difference. Middle Easterners treat history as if it was all compacted into the present. Arabic verbs do not have past, present, and future. Arabic verbs deal with completed action or not completed action. So there's a whole linguistic tendency here for people to think in terms of history as all being right there, not way back there, but right here. Westerners, if they know any history at all, and many of us in America don't know much history, and a lot of our ancestors came here especially to forget their history, we compartmentalize it into various eras in the past. Now, that's the 3 things I'm going to emphasize most. Let's go back now to the Age of Reason. Beginning in the Age of Reason, people began to put much more emphasis on rationality. It's the beginning of the first questions of the authority of the church. It's the beginning, it's the result, partially, a couple of hundred years later, of the Protestant Reformation. And as a result, we've been increasingly trying to be more and more individualistic. All of our psychology is in the last 100 years. Almost all of our psychology books, except a few generalities, almost all of our scientific psychology comes from Freud and people after Freud. Less than 100 years ago. I was alive when he was alive. He didn't die, I think, till 1939. And I was born in 1926. So I was a young man by the time he died. So that's recently that we've begun to think of our psychology. Our psychology is almost entirely built on how an individual adjusts to society. And that doesn't mean how his family adjusts to society, but how he adjusts to society. Protestant theology very strongly emphasizes individual responsibility. We have very strong sense of guilt, inner guilt, and sin. And that's very individual. And it's our individual responsibility to get right with God. When I was growing up, we lived near the dam on the Holston River near Fort Henry Dam. It wasn't built then. We lived on the top of a hill, and our road ended on the highway. And just before you got to our road, there was one of these concrete signs put up by a man who got religion in Middlesboro, Kentucky. And he was in the concrete business. He put up a bunch of concrete signs that said, "Get right." They were crosses. They said, "Get right with God." And they were all over East Tennessee. So we used to tell people, when you get to the sign that says, "Get right with God," turn left to the Leonards. The Protestant theology is strong on this. The West's democracy depends very heavily on individual choice. For us to talk about democracy in Lebanon or in Iraq, where people vote according to their milli, according to their religious community, is a joke. Because these religious communities are dogmatic entities. They are not built to change and to move and to shift like individuals are in a democracy. So that's a very important thing for us to remember, and unfortunately our government has not taken that into consideration when we're talking democracy in the Middle East. Middle Easterners see an ultimate end of individualism is secularism, and from secularism, perhaps agnosticism, and heaven forbid, atheism. Now, one of the things you need to understand is that starting around 1900, increasingly people, even in East Tennessee, began to have more and more doubts about hell, much less fear of going to hell. Now, when I was growing up, we still had a lot of tent meetings here, and preachers would scare people to death about hell. And people would behave very well for weeks on end after these meetings. But there's very little fear of hell anymore. And I suspect, except for older people, not an awful lot of hope of heaven. But you will not find anyone in the Middle East that says that there is not a day of judgment, or that there is not a God, or that they are not afraid of hell and hope for heaven. So that's a very, very big difference between us. Now, I'm going to go to the identity. The primary group identity of an individual is family. If you ask somebody who they are, they will always give you their family name. And family name means an awful lot, because people will not dare misbehave in their family, because, look, in group identity, every single one of my brothers and sisters and parents, aunts and uncles and cousins, if any one of them behaves badly, it reflects on me very strongly. And if I behave badly, I reflect on everyone. So I dare not do anything that the world doesn't like. But one of the saddest parts about this is that if a bad rumor starts about me, even if it's absolutely not true, if someone says something bad about me, it reflects on everyone in my family. Now imagine this. You're not just afraid constantly of doing something wrong that might bring shame on your family. You're terribly afraid that somebody might put the evil eye on you and tell a lie that will bring down the honor of your family. That's a very insecure world to live in. A person in the Middle East is obliged to deny that they made any mistake or did anything wrong. Now, that's not because they're afraid to take responsibility. It's not because they aren't willing to say, I did this or I did that. But I cannot say, I made a mistake, which I did, because it will reflect on all my family. So I am obliged to deny everything and to act as if I never did anything wrong. So when people from here go to the Middle East, they say, people are always lying to you. They aren't lying. They are very honorably standing up for the prestige of their family. They're refusing to let anything, even distantly, reflect on the honor of their family. Also, when I went to the Middle East, I come from East Tennessee, and we play a little game. It's called a false humility. I'm always saying, oh, well, I can't really, I'm not really very good at this and so on. But what I'm really doing is fishing for you to tell me that I'm very wonderful at that. And when you go to the Middle East, whatever you say, because everyone always exaggerates for the sake of the honor of their whole family, they always exaggerate. If their father's a vice president, they say he was a president. If this, they always blow it up. There's a Middle Easterner here laughing very hard. I can tell where she's from. She knows exactly what I'm talking about. And so I went out there to Ramallah, and I said, you know, I'm this, pull this false humble. And they all divided it by 5, and I ended up below 0. So this is another thing that we don't understand when we go in there. There seems to be a Western assumption that individualism is best, even essential. But we must face the facts that individualistic cultures have far more mental and emotional breakdowns than the people do in group cultures. We have many, many more mental patients, far more prisoners than other cultures that are group-oriented. This means that the responsibility of being an individual in the world is very, very difficult. And people have a hard time with it. So group identity, the family takes care of you. You can commit murder, but everyone in your family swear that you're innocent. And they'll fight tooth and nail against everybody in the world to back you up. So that is a tremendous security for anyone that lives in this kind of a group identity. Now I'd like to go on to the idea of nationalism. From the time of Napoleon, in reaction to Napoleon, the Western nations have begun to think of themselves with geographic borders. And so that after World War I, all of these lines are drawn, and the Middle East is beginning to have state geographically defined nationalism. Before that, nationalism might be just in terms of the Duke of Burgundy had allegiance to the King of England or the King of France. This sort of thing could take place. But for the last couple of 100 years, we have tried to define our nationalism by borders. Well, look how strange that makes in this country. How much do we have in common? Now, with this country, our president said, we are a patchwork country, and said it as a wonderful thing, and it's true. We are, even in this room, we represent at least 20 or 30 different cultures in this room. And that's a wonderful thing. And we need not to tolerate each other. Tolerate means, I'll let you be what you are till you get smart enough or lucky enough to be like me. We don't need toleration. We need acceptance and appreciation of differences. Let me give you an example. In the Abbasid period, at the time of the Abbasid period in the East, 755 to 1258, and the Umayyad period in Spain, in the Abbasid era, the Muslims tolerated Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians. Now, the Prophet hadn't mentioned Zoroastrians, but there were so many of them in Mesopotamia that they were given the honorary title of people of the book, like the Jews and the Muslims. The Muslims believe this, that there's a book in heaven, and that book, everything is written in that book, in Arabic, of course. And God gave some of that to Moses. Then he improved on it and gave a little more to Jesus. And then he came along and completed it with Muhammad. But what he gave to Muhammad still is only a tiny part of what's in heaven. It's only what we humans need. So people of the book, Jews and Christians, and by honor accepted, Zoroastrians, excuse me, are people of the book. Muhammad's main interest was against paganism. He was not against Christians and Jews. He was against paganism. And almost everything in his teachings emphasizes that. But the people of the book in Baghdad and in the Abbasid period were tolerated. Over in Spain, the Christians, and this is before Protestants and Catholics, the Christians were Visigoths, Western Goths, and they were largely Unitarian. They weren't terribly strong on the Trinity, to put it mildly. And they and the Jews and the Muslims accepted each other, appreciated each other, went to each other's feasts, read each other's books, and there was a tremendous acceptance and appreciation going on. And the greatest flowering of Jewish culture in all of history was during that period in Spain and in Arabic. The greatest Jewish poetry, the greatest Jewish theology, the greatest Jewish philosophy was written in Arabic in Spain. But when the Pope put pressure on northern Spain with the Crusades, and the first crusade was preached in the middle of France, and the Pope was looking up at a Muslim castle when he did it in Clermont-Ferrand. And the first thing the Crusaders did was push the Arabs and the Muslims out of France. And then the fundamentalist Berbers, Muslim Berbers from North Africa came. All of that ended in Spain around 1100. But in the east, when the Mongols came, the Mongols killed 7 out of the 9 million people in what we call Mesopotamia here, what we now call Iraq. 7 out of the 9 million. Almost all of the 2 million that survived were Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians. What does that tell you? Somebody collaborated. And they collaborated because they'd been tolerated. Don't forget that. People don't like to be tolerated. They want to be accepted and appreciated. And we have a great opportunity in this country to accept and appreciate all kinds of differences. How many people in this room have visited the homes of Jewish families and been to the Friday night Seder and been to Passover with them? How many have visited in Muslim homes? How many have been to the mosque? How many have been to other churches that are not of your religion? There are wonderful opportunities right here in Johnson City to appreciate all kinds of cultures and religions. And this is what the Umayyads did in Spain, but the Abbasids failed to do. So the Muslims, the people in the Middle East, have these various communities, and their loyalty is to their milli. First of all, loyalty is to family. Then from family to clan, from clan to tribe, if there's a tribe, and from tribe to milli. And the whole idea of Western state nationalism is outside that structure. All Muslims believe in the world of Islam. They also at the same time believe in the Arabic world. They have strong loyalty to the Islamic world, to the Arabic world, and to their family, to their milli and to their family. State nationalism since 1920s make these divisions. Their loyalty to that, when I went to the Middle East first in 1950, when I asked someone for their watan, their nationality, they never answered me Syrian or Jordanian or Lebanese, sometimes Lebanese, or even Palestinian. They said, I'm Sunni, I'm Shia, I'm Yahud, I'm Jewish, I'm Latin or Roman Catholic, or I'm Rome, I'm Greek Orthodox, or whatever their milli was. So all of this nationalism is new. We in the West have developed state nationalism to the point that many people will die for their flag and for that state nation. I'm a Quaker and a pacifist, so I'm talking outside the unit. And many of you will spend time in the Middle East to uphold American state territorial nationalism. Even though you may be Lebanese American or Chinese American or whatever, you're American and you wave the flag and you'll fight for it. But that's very new in the Middle East and not very strong, but it is growing. It's worth knowing that this part of Iran, Abadan here, where the oil is almost entirely Arab Sunni Muslims. And yet they fought on the side of Iran against Iraq. Saddam didn't expect that. But the Shias in southern Iraq that we're so worried about joining with Iran fought and killed hundreds of thousands of Iranians and lost hundreds of thousands of their own. And when we left after the first war in Iraq, we asked the Shias to rise up, and they did, and Saddam killed 600,000 Shias and a couple 100,000 Kurds, and we did not go to their aid. But so state nationalism is growing in the Middle East. People will now say, I'm Iraqi, or I'm Jordanian, or I'm Egyptian. And that is growing, but it is still very weak because it is not part of their regular system. It's outside the system. Let's go back to the Ottoman Empire. Let's see the Ottoman again. All of this area, and way down to the Gulf and all this, was ruled by the Ottomans for 500 years, as I said. And during that period, each milli had its own courts and so forth. When Wilson came along in World War I and said, the world believes now in self-determination. Every people can vote and say, we want to have our own nation. When you get to Sarajevo, here in what used to be the Ottoman Empire, later became Yugoslavia, later became Montevideo, Montenegro. When you come to that area, how are people going to vote to have their own nation if they're all living in the same apartment building and have for hundreds of years? And unfortunately, Mr. Wilson and the people in Paris never once mentioned, my class is trying to find one reference during the peace treaty in Paris in which anyone mentioned the fact that throughout the whole Middle East and Balkans, it's impossible to have self-determination because people all live cheek by jowl. They all live in the same buildings. And there's no way you can divide them except ways that were tried after Tito left in Yugoslavia. It's called ethnic cleansing, a very, very ugly thing in which thousands of neighbors killed each other. And in the Middle East, the same thing is true. You cannot divide people into, here are the Sunnis, here are the Shias, and here this. Maybe you can do it in parts of Iraq, but what are you going to do with the 5 million people in Baghdad? They're living cheek by jowl with each other. And there's no dividing that. So this whole business of self-determination of Wilson, it was complete fiasco in a large part of the world, all the world that used to be ruled by the Ottomans, because of that 500 years of independence of the Middle East, or semi-independence. Now, we want to talk about language. Sapir and Worf said language is a way of defining experience for its speakers. In other words, we are what our language says. If our language, the Chinese language has no way of saying, if this, then that. If you want to do that, you have to go a long way around to do it. So the whole idea of planning for the future, or to talking about a theoretical question, is not possible. When I would say to my Chinese students, they were young college teachers, new teachers, when I would say to them, if you had $1 million, what would you do? A shudder would come down over their eyes. I've already said the impossible, if you have $1 million. Now, of course, if I said it today, they might believe me because many Chinese have $1 million. But at that time, that was as much as saying, if you were living on the moon, what would you do? It was a total impossibility. So they can't think of those things because their language doesn't support that. When we started writing English down, there was no subjunctive in English. But the Latin grammarians that wrote English grammar, put in a subjunctive in order that we might have a subjunctive, because after all, they believed that Latin reflected the way the human mind worked. They really believe that, and there are many Latin teachers today that still believe that. So, but the truth is that language reflects the culture. There are cultures in Africa that have 20 different ways of expressing differences in spiritual possession. We don't have much need for 20 different ways of spiritual possession. The Arabs have about 200 words for a camel. They've got a separate word for a little white camel with a broken front left leg. We use adjectives, but they had specific words. We don't have much use for that. Definitely, the Eskimos don't have much use to talk about sheep and so forth. When they wanted to talk about the sheep, the good shepherd, they had to talk about the good seals. So the things have to fit the language and the culture. Now, for most Westerners, especially Americans, people have very little knowledge of their history.